Hey everyone, today we were talking about the Mesopotamian context of the sons of God and Nephilim in Genesis 6. As many of you know, sadly, Dr. Michael Heiser has passed recently. He's gone, which is it's very sad to see. Coincidentally, Dr. Heiser got a lot of his research on the sons of God from the scholar we are talking to today, so it's an absolute pleasure to talk to someone who played such a pivotal role in why I and many others care so much about studying the ancient Near East and the Bible. Today I am interviewing Dr. Amar Annus, who is a very highly esteemed Assyriologist at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He has written some really great works on the Mesopotamian god Ninurta, a recent article on Job, a great article on the origin of the Watchers, which is why we're here today, and many others. Dr. Annus, thank you so much for coming on to talk with us today.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm sorry to hear that Michael Heiser has passed away. I have not yet heard this news.
Yes,
But
very sad for sure. It's very, very sad for sure. A lot of people, he was very important to a lot of people. But anyway, so can you give us just your background and in regards to ancient Near Eastern studies and this topic here?
yes, everything is correct. I am an Assyriologist. I have a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies from the University of Helsinki in Finland. And my first degree was in theology at the University of Tartu, and after that it was in the middle of 90s. I was able to go to study in Helsinki, and during this time there was this excellent project of state archives of Assyria going on in Helsinki. So I could study Mesopotamian languages, history with excellent tutors there, and later I took my PhD from Helsinki, and later I also worked at the Oriental Institute in Chicago for 1 year. I worked in Berlin in Germany and few other places, but mostly I've been in Tartu in Estonia. So my affiliation is right now um, um, to the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Tartu. Tartu is a place in southern Estonia, which is a small place. It is 100,000 inhabitants, but its uh, reputation as a university town is actually greater than its size. So it is a bit, it is a matter of proud for Estonians to the University of Tartu. But okay, that's okay. So um, what we are going to speak uh, today.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so in 2010, you published a paper called A Comparative Study of the Antediluvian Wisdom in Mesopotamian and Jewish Traditions. That's a mouthful. Can you give us a general overview of what that was about?
The longest story is that um, after my PhD, uh, my supervisor in Helsinki applied for a grant uh, to study um, intellectual heritage of ancient Mesopotamia uh, in East and West, as it was conceived during this time. And I spent 3 years working on a database that was Melamu database on internet, and I had a lot of time to think about uh, Mesopotamian cultural heritage and different forms of it. Uh, uh, and uh, when I started to think about biblical and Mesopotamian uh, historiography, uh, then I started to notice some similarities with how so-called pre-flood or antediluvian history was conceived in Mesopotamia and in the Bible. So, uh, and little by little, I um, I started to see more parallels with with biblical historiography and Mesopotamian, and I wrote this paper about Nephilim. So this paper is about uh, how antediluvian uh, uh, wisdom, antediluvian knowledge was conceived in biblical and the Mesopotamian world. And as I show in this paper, that that there were many um, uh, many similarities. Actually, these two uh, traditions are quite parallel, but in the way that that Jewish or biblical uh, historiography has in many ways um, changed the original Mesopotamian tradition, so that uh, do you have um, but can you tell me how you understand this paper, or how what should I explain more properly about that?
And the subject was basically just the origin of the Watchers, right? That were you the first person to write on this topic, or were the other people?
I remember when I started to write this paper, there were very few previous studies. One of them was by Anne Kilmer, um which connected the Watcher story um, with Mesopotamian mythology, and I cited this paper, um, but the thing was that when I started to work on it, I discovered more and more uh, details, more and more parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical mm, accounts. So uh, when you open the Bible uh, from Genesis 6, uh, uh, there you can see this confusing story about the sons of God uh, going down from heaven, and this story is not intelligible in its own terms. Actually, it is very confusing story, and it in this context it makes no sense actually, um, and it is difficult to understand what is being said there. But Jewish Jewish texts have um, have parallels to this story, which are more intelligible. For example, in the books of Enoch, in books of Jubilees, and other stories that can help to reconstruct what is actually being said in this Genesis 6 story. so that there were certain angels who came to Earth with the original mission to teach mankind. So and to care about uh, culture, to nourish the intellect, so to say. This was their original mission when they came to Earth. But later they got corrupted. They started to see that daughters of man were beautiful, and they started to teach bad things to humankind. So this story has several versions, but and also contradicting versions. But when compared to the Mesopotamian lore, it can be shown that that um, that the biblical story is a version of an ancient Near Eastern story of the culture bringers, or the Apkallu myth. So the Apkallu myth is about the origins of culture and the origins of important things that that were brought by certain uh, sages. Sage is a wise man that lived among humankind before the flood. So this is a story that is best known from the Hellenistic writer Berossos. So during Hellenistic times, these kind of competitive stories about antiquity of cultures emerged. So that Berossos was a Babylonian priest in the 3rd century BC, who wrote a book on Babylonian culture, and in this book he wrote about early history of Babylonia and how a certain man came out of the sea. So this is more or less a fairy tale, or this kind of story that there was a man who was half man, half fish, who came out of the Persian Gulf and started to teach humankind about different cultural achievements, how to how to make things, and how to build civilization. And it is said by Berossus that everything that he taught was never superseded, so that this knowledge that he brought with him was excellent, and nothing new after that has been invented. So that this is a myth of cultural origins. And and he also says that when this Oannes, this mythological being, disappeared, then after that more sages like him came to humankind to to add to uh, to give some more instruction and information how to build civilization. So this kind of myth about cultural origins and how certain things have been learned by humankind. And the context of this story is Hellenistic, because in Hellenistic world, uh, this intercultural competition emerged, in which every nation started to think about their cultural origins and also started to write books about how their culture, for example, Babylonian or Egyptian, was the most prestigious and most ancient one in the earth, on earth, and um, one example of this is Berosso's book about Babylonia. But another example is Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote about the same things in Egyptian culture. So that this idea of cultures competing with one another in the sense of which one is most ancient, most honorable, is actually a kind of global idea of Hellenism, from which Berosso's book also comes from. Sorry, maybe I have diverged from the original topic.
Oh, no, that's totally awesome. Yeah. Feel free to say whatever you feel is relevant there here. Okay, so at the beginning of your paper, you talked about how the biblical character of Enoch in Genesis 5 seems to have a Mesopotamian background related to King Enmeranki. Can you talk about how the two might relate?
Yes, this is a certain text, a cuneiform text uh, that that is about this king Enmeduranki, who was given an audience with the sun god and um, the god of thunder, Adad, Shamash and Adad, and he was taught about liver divination, which is this is a Latin term, extispicy. Extispicy is a term for liver divination in ancient Mesopotamia. Liver divination was a very important priestly lore, and it was very elaborated kind of science, and it consisted of sacrifice of a lamb and opening of its intestines to see what is there and what it reveals for the future. And there are there is a corpus of extispicy texts in cuneiform, which explain how to interpret very detailed instructions how to interpret the liver signs, the signs that are seen in lamb's liver, how to interpret them, and this was this was a very elaborate and prestigious science in ancient Mesopotamia. So this Enmeduranki is a kind of patron of this science, and this text, Enmeduranki text, explains how this science was revealed to Enmeduranki. It was revealed from the deities. It was given to him, and it is also said that the King Enmeduranki forwarded this knowledge to the sons of Sippar and to priests, to the priests who carried on this science. So it is also kind of it is an etiological myth. Etiological means that it tells the origins of certain things, just like Apkallu myth, or different versions of Apkallu myths in Mesopotamia. It is a story about how certain things came about in most ancient times, how they were, how important science is, and knowledge was revealed to humans by these early revelators, early sages. And my paper about watchers is the basic idea in this paper is that Jewish lore has turned around or reversed this Mesopotamian stories in this way that that the story of watchers says that during early history of humankind there were some wicked teachers who had questionable reputation and who came to humans to teach things not appropriate. So this kind of Mesopotamian story about the origins of beautiful things and useful knowledge is turned around in this way that Jewish versions of the same story tell about bad things being taught to humankind, and these teachers were Apkallus or Nephilim, who came down from heaven, and so the consequences of their teachings were not good, but they were bad for humankind. So can you help me with further questions?
But even in the Genesis 5 story with Enoch, it's barely ever mentioned, and it's not even connected to any type of watchers or sons of God. But in the book of Enoch, it's written way later, talks about how these Enoch is actually connected to these fallen angels.
Actually, in Aramaic, these watchers are called the root is in Aramaic is Ein Resh, which is means to be sleepless. Actually, these are angels who never sleep, and in Mesopotamia, um, the related idea is the image of a fish in iconography, in pictorial representation of Apkallos, in that they are half fish and half humans, just like this Annus who came out of the sea in the first day of the world. Sorry, I don't have pictures ready to show you here, but this image of a fish is also relates to sleeplessness. It is the image of a being whose eyes are always open. The ancient sages were taught as kind of beings that had insomnia, some sort of inability to sleep. This is also an interesting aspect of these ancient sages.
Do you think the Mesopotamians actually back then thought that they had fish heads?
Yes, the half fish, half human form of Apkallu is only one form of it, because they were also thought to consist of other hybrid creatures. One form was half bird, like having wings and head of a bird, which is also a form of Apkallu. Then half fish creatures. So there are different forms of hybrids. So in this sense, what it means that they were imagined as not regular human figures, but in some way supernatural creatures who had animal features or fish features, which contributed to their how would I say, otherworldliness or divine nature.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so later in your paper, you talk about how, or you argue that there is adaptations of Mesopotamian lore in Genesis in respect to the line of 10 patriarchs, Genesis 5, that are seen as positive in the story. But then, many people are familiar with, how they are portrayed in Genesis. Could you talk about what you think is the Mesopotamian background for these figures?
When we speak about this tradition of history of the pre-flood period, it is important to notice this sequence of generations, and this is something that is in a way parallel with Mesopotamian tradition and biblical, that they speak about generations of humankind, and in Mesopotamia, this sequence of these early sages is also a sequence of seven important people. So there are it is the myth of seven pre-flood teachers of humankind. And actually, in cuneiform, we have texts that some texts that list these 7 sages by giving their names, and there is one text which also names the kings that were associated with these sages, so that there were 7 antediluvian generations of kings who had particular sages who taught or them or gave some information during the times of these kings. So this is a kind of Mesopotamian tradition. And what I think is that the biblical writers, the writers of Genesis, also used the same pattern or same kind of schema of antediluvian generations, and of course everything that was told in folklore, in living folklore of ancient Israel, was not written down in the Bible, of course, because only a part of it was written down, but lot of material also circulated only in oral lore, and therefore books of Enoch or these pseudepigraphical literature, this kind of literature is also important to learn what was this oral lore about, how what kind of stories circulated in among ancient Jewish writers, so that the books of Enoch is an example of this oral lore that that also Mesopotamian that also Jewish tradition considered the early history of humankind of some kind of sequence of teachers or authorities teaching mankind, and Enoch was one of them, the most prominent one, who had special knowledge, and he imparted this knowledge to humankind. And this is something that that is at least partly taken from Mesopotamian traditions that tell about Enmeduranki and Annus and other sages who taught mankind. So that in Jewish tradition, Enoch is the authority, the owner of knowledge, but in Jewish lore, Enoch is somehow he's a superior or overseer of watchers, which means that Jewish writers want to say that Enoch is superior to watchers, which means that their knowledge, their called their national hero, Enoch, is in all ways possible superior to watchers, which means that their cultural wisdom is superior to Mesopotamian wisdom, which is the story of watchers. What they want to say with this uh, with the story. So this, in order to understand this, I have to say a few sentences about the thing that can be called the counter narrative. Counter narrative is something that counters previous knowledge. And when we see, for example, in United States, you have two parties, two political parties, two main parties. So they tell things about the same things in an opposite way in most of the matters. So that what is a pro narrative, what is a good narrative for one, is a counter narrative for another. So and this is also the case for in early history of humankind in biblical tradition and Mesopotamian tradition. So what is good for Mesopotamians is very bad for Jewish writers. So this is the idea of counter narrative, that you take the original story and turn it around in many ways, so that basically what a Republican says is turned around by a Democrat, and vice versa. So in the Bible we have many examples of these counter narratives, and actually learning Mesopotamian traditions, Mesopotamian lore, is quite informative in studying Bible, because it is from the same cultural context, from about the same period, and what the Jewish writers had to do was to struggle with this cultural dominance of a foreign culture that they had to oppose in every possible way, and to write counter narratives to turn these things around that that they felt they felt were oppressive for them. For example, I have experienced I have a lifetime experience of being an Estonian, for example. Estonia is a small country which has this big neighbor, Russia. We have many hundred kilometers of the common border with Russia, and we have also hundreds of years of experience of being oppressed politically by Russian culture. So in Estonian culture, we have a lot of examples of such kind of counter narratives of things that were imposed on Estonians, that were opposed or rejected by this kind of counter narrative. And this is, I think, also applies to the Watcher story, that certain things that were imposed to ancient Israelites, like this cultural dominance of Mesopotamia, were opposed and turned around by using these counter narratives. and this Watcher story is one example of this kind of narratives.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the texts interact with each other. You have maybe these Jews that are in this Babylonian context, and they see these Apkallu, and they decide to portray them as, really evil creatures and all that, when we don't necessarily see that in the text. But at the same time, there were some that were portrayed as doing bad things in Mesopotamian literature. Can you talk about that?
Of course, this story about the most ancient wisdom in Mesopotamia, it was a story about positive wisdom, good knowledge, etc. But Mesopotamian culture lasted for many thousand years, and during all this, what happened, there also emerged some other uh, uh, traditions within big traditions, so that there are some examples of texts that also uh, tell about uh, sages, these carriers of ancient wisdom, negative characters as witches, or there are some examples of incantations. For example, um, in Mesopotamia, we have in cuneiform literature we have this prolific genre of anti-witchcraft literature, incantations, where certain spells are sung to counter witchcraft, and this literature is quite huge actually. Many examples, and among them are a few which also counter the witchcraft by made by Apkallu, so that so these sages were also viewed as capable of witchcraft. So there is trend of seeing them as negative also in Mesopotamian lore. And what I write in my article is that this part of the tradition were also used by Jewish writers when they counter idea of Mesopotamian wisdom. They could make use of view of negative Apkallus. They could take it already from the Mesopotamian culture. They didn't have to invent it 100%, but they could already use it as it was in Mesopotamia.
You talked about how, we have these Apkallu figures that are like mixed animal slash human type of figures. Can you is it uh by chance, was there any of these that were actually giants?
Yes, this uh, giant form um, is also found in Mesopotamia. For example, there is information in the uh, Epic of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh epic uh, is an important part of Mesopotamian literature. It is about the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, and his friend Enkidu. And this epic gives the dimensions, physical dimensions of Gilgamesh, which is said to be 11 cubits. So 11 cubits in the United States, there is different system of measurements, but meters, it is half a meter. So Gilgamesh is 5.5 meters tall. So if he would be a basketball player, the basket would be on the chest. So really a tall guy. Yes. And and this is part of this the tradition that says that the earliest human beings on Earth were giants, and this is something that is found in many cultures of uh, uh, very many human cultures. This kind of belief that early humans were giants. And this also applies to Apkallu tradition because in Jewish lore it is said that when watchers came down, they were encountered by human women, and their offspring were giants. So the giants were hybrids of humans and divine. And in Mesopotamia, there are some texts that also relate to divinities, to deities, and this idea of being gigantic or giant relates to divinity. And one example is this Gilgamesh example that the early heroes and kings were giants, but also divinities could be gigantic size. So this is, I think, also similar in Watchers traditions, in Jewish tradition, and in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, we actually have references to some of the Mesopotamian figures in the Book of the Giants, right?
Yes, this was a book uh, that survives only in fragments from the caves of Qumran. There are only a few fragments of the Book of Giants, but this was a book in Second Temple Judaism, maybe third century BCE. Book of Giants was a part of Jewish culture, but it did not survive, but it survived only in translation to other languages and in Qumran fragments. And this book also tells about these pre-flood um, giants, and and also mentions their names. And I think Gilgamesh is one of them. It's a name of a giant in this book, and there are other other characters of Mesopotamian lore also mentioned in this Jewish book. So that some important mythological characters of Mesopotamia were known in Judaism as um, as giants, uh, and these giants uh, were formed a group, and Enoch was uh, some kind of a commander of this group, or authority of this group was Enoch. So this was a way of saying that um, that Enoch uh, is the most important authority during early history of humankind, and these Mesopotamian authorities were subservient to him, so they were of less importance.
This has been so amazing. I really, really appreciate you talking to me about this topic. I'm sure people in the watching this are going to really enjoy it. Can you give us any resources or ways that we can read some of your content?
Thinking that I make available almost all of my stuff, all of my papers on the page academia.edu. Edu. So this is a free site, and mm, I on this page I have a personal page on this website where I have almost everything which I have published, and even some things that have not yet been published, but I post them there when uh, uh, when I think it is appropriate. So and I can be contacted also through this page, and of course using my email. So I recommend to see this page and what is there, And if I always try to respond to queries also from people whom I don't know so well. I think Academia Edu is.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, guys, everyone, make sure to check out his stuff. Dr. Annus is such a great scholar. I really appreciate Dr. Annus you coming on here. This has been so awesome. Make sure to like and subscribe, guys. Help out support the channel, and if you wanna hear more content about like this from the channel, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. So, yeah, anyways, I once again really appreciate you coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I
I
I was sad
I was
to
sad
hear
to hear
about
about
Michael Heiser
Michael Heiser
passing away.
passing away.
Um,
Um,
I never
I
met
never
him,
met
but
him, but
I know
I know he
he was
he was an
he was an
he was an
interesting.
interesting.
Uh,
Uh,
he had
he had
non-standard
non-standard
ideas
ideas
about the
about the
Bible, and
Bible, and
I really
I really
appreciate.
appreciate.
Okay, thanks
Okay,
for
thanks
Yeah.
for
uh,
uh,
discussion.
discussion.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Have a good one.